So, good evening and welcome to the Dusty Feet. Thursday night. It's August 4th, so we begin August. Very exciting. Today, I got some new devices. I got a new cochlear, right? And then a new hearing aid. And I have joined more of the land of the hearing. It was a rather enlightening day. It started out very early with a 5 a.m. drive to Charleston. And on the drive back, I could hear things that I hadn't heard before. I got in the car and I started to drive, and my hands are sliding on the steering wheel, and I can hear my hands sliding on the steering wheel. And part of me went, "This is is this what other people hear too?" It's one of those crazy things. But again, welcome to the land of the hearing. So it's kind of fun, right? So tonight, in the land of hearing, we're going to talk about the exile and the way home. This is an interesting conversation between Tim Mackie and John Collins. It's on the Bible Project app under the Exile skill set. Uh, but I enjoyed this particular conversation, and there's some neat things in there that I think we can talk about and discuss, and things to brew on and chew on, right? So don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. Want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So please be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings might exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more Bible Project fun on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so tonight there's a milestone I hit, a little tidbit that I hit with the notes for this episode. I use Apple Notes for really most of my note taking. Um, in one of the latest upgrades, you can hashtag the notes, and then you'll be able to find them again just by searching a hashtag. This is not a pitch for Apple, just an insight into what I use and how I use it. But then in reference to this, I hit 800 notes. That's of course over the course of almost 10 years. But the hashtag thing is relatively new. So I need to go back, go over all of my notes, and give them hashtags that they might need, right? So I did already start that a bit, and I saw a lot of things I took notes on, mostly churchy stuff for sure. And I saw where I've really grown. And to be honest, maybe changed what I thought or what I believed back then, and what's evolved and changed. It's been a bit of an eye opener for me, but my thought was not to delete what I now don't believe, right? But to keep and document those growth points, those other milestones that I might not even have seen them as milestones at the time. But looking back, they were pivots and paradigm changes for sure, right? So here is to being on our way to 1,000 notes, right? Hopefully, I'll get better at the hashtags too, right? Okay. So let's take some time and listen to this clip um, and this conversation between Tim Mackie and John Collins on the exile and the way home. and I really hope you'll enjoy it.
Hey, this is John at the Bible Project. We've spent the last 5 weeks on this podcast talking about the biblical theme of exile.
The exile of the Judeans to Babylon in 586 BC. It's what all of us woke up thinking about this morning.
So this week, we're going to bring it all together. We're going to finish this conversation. Imagine being away from home for a long time. Maybe you're a soldier, an expat, or just some sort of wanderer. And many years have gone by, and you think back to the good things that made home what it was. You begin to get this nostalgia for home that grows and grows. Now, imagine after all this time, decades have passed, and you get to go back home. You arrive, and you find, as great as home is, it's not as wonderful as you remembered.
The story of exile in the Bible is of God's people coming back to the land promised to them, but the way that it's ruled and the way that they live on it is now, this is our home, but it's not being run like our home. It's not being run by the values of God's kingdom.
The ancient Israelites were stuck in Babylon, homesick for the good old days of King David and King Solomon. And when they got to go back home, they found it was nothing like they had remembered. But they held on to their nostalgia as a taste for something good yet to come. Like them, we're homesick too. We have a nostalgia for things we haven't even fully experienced. Our desire is, well,
A desire for home, because it's a desire for something that has actually never appeared in our experience.
There's a memory, something only I could know. It's a wildfire, burns everywhere I go. But I know the way home. I know the way home.
Thanks for joining us today as we finish up our conversation on the exile. Here we go.
You want to try and summarize it all?
Well, let me try it in a way we haven't summarized it. Okay. You know that feeling that while this is our home, this is our family, these are our friends, this is my job, this is my existence, it doesn't feel right. Something's missing, something's incomplete. I'm home, but I feel like a stranger in my own existence. I think a lot of people can identify with that, what we've been calling the existential angst. What is that? Why is that? Well, here's how the Bible talks about it. The Bible talks about humanity having a home that wouldn't create that angst, where things are good, where relationships are right, where there's a connection with the divine, with God, where you're not trying to figure out what's good and bad on your own. You actually are doing this in this relationship with a power that's greater than you and that's wiser than you. And it leads to abundance and peace. That's actually what we're craving. And that's what the Garden of Eden was. And that was lost. And so the first story of the Bible is really about how we are strangers in our own land. We've been banished from what is truly good, and now we're just kind of aching for it.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you when you're summarizing, but it reminded me of the C.S. Lewis quote that captures like precisely what you're getting at, the existential angst.
Okay.
It's in The Weight of Glory.
Okay.
Which is a whole essay that he wrote about how our existential longings are pointers to not projections that we're just fantasizing about and projecting up into the sky, but that they're real. And he calls it the inconsolable longing. Do you know about this passage?
I might be familiar with it.
Okay, it's from The Weight of Glory.
Is this the one like eating mud pies kind of thing?
No,
okay.
It's different, but that is also in The Weight of Glory. Yeah.
Okay.
So he calls it a desire for a far-off country. That's why I'm thinking of it. A desire for home. So he says, in speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, that we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I'm almost committing an indecency, trying to name it. I'm trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of us. It's a secret that hurts so much that we take revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia or romanticisms or remembering our adolescence. It's a secret that pierces with such sweetness that when in very intimate conversation, the mention of it becomes imminent and we grow awkward and we try to laugh at ourselves. It's a secret we cannot hide, a secret we cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We can't tell about it because it's a desire for something that has actually never appeared in our experience. We can't hide it because our life experiences are constantly suggesting this longing, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Some call it beauty, our experience of beauty, and act as if that settled the matter. But this is a cheat. If we could go back to those moments in the past, we would find not the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. And what we remembered experiencing would turn out itself to be only a remembering. Okay, here we go. This gets even better. It's already really good. He says, the books or the music in which we thought our experience of beauty was located, these will betray us if we trust it to them. The beauty was never in them. Rather, it came through them. And what came through them was the longing. These things, like beauty, nostalgia, the memory of our past, are only images of what we really desire. But if we mistake them for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. They are not the thing itself. It's the last line. They are only the scent of a flower we have not yet found, the echo of a tune we have not yet heard, and news from a country we have not yet visited. He opens and closes
with the far away,
with these far-off land. So beautiful.
Yeah.
So yeah, his point. Well, I don't even need to say it. Do I need to summarize?
No.
Like
no,
we get
it's the longing.
It's the longing.
And his point is, don't make that longing an idol to where you are now just trying to seek the things that stirred up that longing.
Yes.
You're now trying to seek those as the end.
In a way, that's an interesting way to think about Babylon. It's a way of securing and trying to make material and normal the thing, what transcendence.
I think Portland's actually pretty good at that.
Yeah, actually.
Right?
Many cities are. They become playgrounds and distractions.
Yeah.
For...
Like,
that's true.
You think gardening is blissful,
and in a way it is,
and completes some longing in your soul.
Yeah,
let's double down and make everyone's front yard a garden.
Yeah, and a chicken farm.
And a chicken farm.
Yeah,
and that will solve it. And I guess what C.S. Lewis is saying is, well, no, that feeling you got while gardening, that was an echo of a tune we haven't yet heard.
Yes. Yeah.
So enjoy it. And let it point you towards this thing.
But don't mistake it for home.
But don't mistake it for home.
Your true...
While you do it.
Yeah.
Participate in it.
Appreciate
and
it.
Appreciate it.
It's almost like the analog of loyalty and subversion. I appreciate it.
But I'm not going to worship it.
But I don't mistake it for the meaning of my life.
Right.
And so in the same way, we are called to love God and love neighbor.
Yeah.
And we might come up with a really great system.
Yeah.
Or a way of organizing a neighborhood or a country.
Yeah.
That fosters that. But inevitably, it will have brokenness and selfishness built into it. And the idolatry is to name this particular solution as the divine answer.
It's kind of why the Jewish festival is Sukkot. It's like, hey, we love our home. But like, let's once a week.
Once a year.
For a week.
Yeah.
Live outside of it.
Yes.
Like we don't have a home.
Yes.
Because let's not mistake this as our real home.
Yeah. It's very similar.
So getting back to the Garden of Eden thing. So the Garden of Eden is saying, if we could put a name to the tune we have not heard, if we could put a name to the flower that, or what does he say? The smell of a
Scent of a flower we have not yet found.
Yeah, the scent of a flower we have not yet found.
Yeah.
If that has a name and a picture, the biblical picture is of Eden, which is a very simple yet, not very concrete picture. I mean, there's not a lot there.
Yeah. Well, it's just of this amazing garden.
It's an amazing garden. It's got 4 rivers.
Yeah. If you believe in a beautiful mind and heart out of which the universe sprang, that being wants to be in very close, intimate.
It's the place where you can be in complete,
which means
close, intimate connection.
to know that you belong in this world.
Yeah.
And that you're welcome here.
I see.
And that you're loved and have a role and a purpose, right? I think that's what it means to believe in the Christian God, is to believe all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Eden.
So what we're
That's
talking
home.
about is home with
home.
capital H.
That's right. Yes.
And what we have is echoes of that that are very tangible. It's so funny to be reminded of something you've never experienced.
Yeah, right.
That's the whole thing
That's the paradox
Lewis is
of it.
riffing
That's
off
right.
of there.
That's right. Yes.
And that's the reality is we're constantly being reminded of this state of being that we've never experienced, but somehow we long for. And it's capital H home.
And we get glimpses, real glimpses of.
Yeah.
Through life experiences.
Yeah.
That make us want more of that. And they give us peace.
So that's the image of Genesis. But then you get the story of Israel.
Yes.
And the story of Israel is a man named Abraham who was called by God to make a family that lives by such an ethic that they can recreate that reality.
Or at least experience more. Yeah, experience within their family.
Within their family.
More.
And then take it outside of their family. Yeah. And that the nations can experience it to find that sweetness. Yeah. What did he say? The pierced with such sweetness. That's such a good line.
Yeah.
And so Abraham's called to do that. Along with that is this promise that he'll have a place to call home because he was a wanderer. He didn't have a homeland.
Yes.
And so that becomes the promised land, which now the people of Israel, who eventually inhabit the descendants of Abraham, inhabiting the promised land, they see that as this image of Eden, this abstraction of what Eden represents.
Well, more as a reverse, the concrete.
Sorry.
The concrete.
Yeah, the concrete example of this Eden
home
abstraction. And it makes sense because that's what God was calling Israel to create. But they're banished from it because they're not creating it, but they're creating Babylon within it. And so their banishment from exile, or their banishment from Israel, makes them exiles in a foreign country, into Babylon. And now they're looking at this biblical story of Adam and Eve being banished from the garden. They're saying, yeah, that's our story, being banished from the good. But while the Garden of Eden actually was good, like Israel never actually attained that. Yeah. But they were called to it, but they never actually attained it.
Yes. And they turned to stories from their past.
Right, the nostalgia.
Yeah, the nostalgia of the eras of David and Solomon.
Because it was
the closest experiences they can think
of. An echo of the tune.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because
that's all they have.
Yes, which is why the hoped-for age of the kingdom of God is described as the reign of not even a new David. Ezekiel just calls the Messiah in the kingdom of God. He calls the Messiah David.
Yeah.
Just David.
Yeah. Let's get him back in charge.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what they don't mean is let's time warp historical David. What they mean is
let's resurrect his body and put him in
the ultimate home that David represents in their
imagination,
in their hope, and in their scriptures is what they want. Yeah.
David is the scent of the flower they have not seen.
Yeah.
But it's what they have.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Beautiful. Okay. And there are a few things we can think about, and we'll probably only touch on a couple of them. And I'm sure you can think of a ton more to think about. So, one of the points that comes to me, and remember, I tend to think a bit upside down. I like going back to the beginning. I like going back to the garden versus the land, as in the Garden of Eden and Eden. Okay. Back there, we have two exile stories back in the beginning, right? We have Adam and Eve from the garden. We have Cain from the land of Eden itself. Okay. Also, one of the challenges in Scripture um, can be that things we oft just glance by and look over because of a paradigm that we have. For instance, in the Adam and Eve in the garden, they're exiled. We get that, right? And we get Cain and Abel. We get that, and Cain kills Abel. We get that. And we have that all locked up in a tidy little box. And then we get to God dealing with Cain. Okay. So Genesis 4 and 11 through I think 17-ish or something like that. So 11 says, now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a wanderer and a drifter on earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to endure. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and I will be hidden from your face, and I will be a wanderer and a drifter on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him 7 times as much. And the Lord placed a mark on Cain so that no one finding him would kill him. Then Cain left the presence of the Lord, settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived, and she gave birth to Enoch. And Cain built a city and named the city Enoch after the name of his son. So I'm really fascinated with the Cain story in a few ways. So one, God does not kill Cain. Yet later in the Torah, we have instruction that unjustified killing is a death penalty offense. Equal measure, right? Fascinating. Now, a detail in the Abel death story is in the verbiage that we see in God's accounting in Hebrew, right? The word blood that we have is actually bloods, as in plural, okay? Plural. The rabbis point to this as a perpetuity statement, okay? Not only the blood of your brother, but all of the blood's lives, remember, life's in the blood, who would have come from him cry out to me. So it's not just his death, but everybody that would have come through time through Abel. Now, so then it's even more interesting that God does, because remember, Cain's a farmer. That's what he does. That's him. We might even say purpose, just for fun. Abel was a herdsman, right? We know that, right? So God's curse, his judgment on Cain, is personal, extremely personal. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a wanderer and a drifter on the earth. Picture no longer being able to do what you're supposed to do. How does that sit with you? Exiled from the land he lived in. By extension, his family, although that can be a different discussion as well. since Cain doesn't even mention his parents, right? Probably more coffee discussion needed on that one for sure. So we have an exile with not being able to do his thing. Not be able to do his thing. Now let's stretch that a bit, okay? And say Adam and Eve were priests, right? Or at least priestly figures, representatives, right, in the garden. And they are exiled to Eden. They're just taken out of the garden. They're in Eden still. They're in the land of Eden, just out there. But they're outside the garden, the tabernacle, temple, the space where God meets man, this overlapping space. So they're exiled. And maybe also no longer able to do what they were supposed to do. So maybe exile in these has a twofold face on it. On one side is where you're intended to be, and on the other side is not doing what you were intended to do. I'm not sure if that 100% works, but it's a study line that I'm currently on, and it's driving this conversation. Okay. So with that as the beginning of this red string kind of connection, now we can take this right a little further, I hope. Okay, now we do have a thought that probably needs to be addressed. Probably first is Adam and Eve's purpose outside the garden. Okay, they were exiled from there. So now what was their purpose? So we have maybe lost the priestly duties, but the rest of the initial purpose and the duties would still apply, the initial ones. Genesis 1:28. So God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over every living thing that moves on the earth." So those duties, that purpose, far wider than the garden. We know that that extends outside the garden for all the people there. So they still had a purpose, and the whole earth applied. But that was rough. Cain had a horrible, traumatic exile. Not even sure if death would have been better, right? But he's stripped of purpose, forced to wander, and he knows he'll be separated from God, at least as far as he understood, right? And then I thought about God protecting him. He is the eldest son and the only surviving son at the time, right? Because Seth isn't born yet. So God still chooses to protect him. Not sure why, other than mercy and grace. Yes, even way back then, we still had mercy and grace. And since Cain was scared because he knew he knew that word would get out of what he had done. Maybe it says, "Behold, right? You've driven me this day from the face of the ground. I will be hidden from your face, and I will be a wanderer and a drifter on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So part of that challenge is if you think that there's only 3 people on the planet at that time, you're thinking, well, are mom and dad going to kill me because this is the only deal? So we already have that nice little box is starting to come open and things we should have stuffed in it, and we have that continued problem. So he knew that leaving the land of Eden, not the garden, but the land, would also separate him from God. So we can maybe assume, and I know assume is really scary, And so we want to do that with a bit of open palmed thought, right? Maybe that Cain also didn't believe in that God is everywhere all the time kind of thought. God, this is not the protector. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is that really isn't the God that's talked about in the Old Testament, anyways. In the Tanakh, that's just not a concept that plays out there. But especially here in this one, we're not there. Yet God still protected him. He marked him, and he set a curse on anyone who'd killed Cain. 7 times the punishment. How do you, if the punishment is unjustified killing is death, how do you kill somebody 7 times? So we know that that probably doesn't go well for whoever would have been. The other thing that pops in my head is, what would the mark look like? Really, what did the mark look like? Big tattoo? I don't know what the mark looked like. But we know his life would now not have the purpose, and yet he'd see others flourishing in their purpose. What he'd see around is he'd see all those people, maybe in a joyful, working out their purpose state. And that has got to be, again, another traumatic, crushing blow that you're going to live. You're going to live, Cain. Does God spare his life? Yes. But it's not a life I'd want to have. And I wonder if Cain ever told his wife, right? The one that he met in Nod, right? So Cain doesn't meet his wife till Nod. Okay, that's a land. And that's east of Eden, mind you, is Nod. And did she ever maybe tell him who he was and what he had done, right? I guess maybe the Mark might have told the story. We don't know. She marries him anyways. Interesting. That's just thinking out loud. Okay. I would also expect that the exile of Adam and Eve to be as stressful, maybe not entirely as void of purpose, but it still would be harder. Not only physically, perhaps, but without God's direct support and maybe even guidance, that would have scared them, caused strife with them as a relationship. God said it would be harder, that you'd have to figure out how to do things and live life on your own with your own ideas. You chose to decide the right and wrong for yourselves, the consequences of the fruit, right? God will let us live our consequences of our choices. Our ways will always ultimately end up in death. But God, like these exiles, eventually are given away home. So with that, so now let's jump into exile today, right? How we might view it, maybe, what our concept is for what we think about it, and maybe how it might apply to us, right? So it might be said of us, although I think traditional churchianity doctrine might be a bit confused in itself about this point, but we could be considered in exile, right? And I guess it's how you view exile. And John and Tim were kind of bouncing around that idea about how we view exile. Okay, so here we can get a bit of a rabbi hole here. So hang on, because it's probably going to be a bumpy ride. But we'll see. So are we, as in the masses, who are not genetic Israelites, we are of the nations, right? Are we actually exiled from the land promised to Israel, promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Might we be in exile because we are void of an Eden, a place of overlap, that overlap between heaven and earth. Okay. Okay. So if you're using the Bible Project app and listening to the various podcasts, in the skills section, you'll find the episode that we just listened to again, right? It's the last episode of the Exile skills. I think it's episode 6. Okay. So if you're listening to all of them, um, they they string together the thoughts on Eden, tabernacle, temple, these overlapping spaces for God to dwell. The latter two being representations of the former, right? The tabernacle and the temple are representations of Eden, that far back memory. Okay, so these Eden, these overlapping spaces, are in proximity to the land that they're attached. Follow me. They're in proximity to the land that they're attached. This is interesting. Eden was a garden attached to Eden, and even probably in the middle, at least the rabbis say so. Okay. The tabernacle was in the midst of the community, right? So here's the tabernacle. And this is just one of those drawings that somebody came up with. But this is basically how it's explained in scripture. This is how somebody's representation off of what is written, how they would go out. It always fascinates me if you gave somebody a definition or a description of a picture, or gave them a word story, and then they have to draw it and paint it. How many different representations you would see? How many of the elements in it would look similar, and how many would look very different because of where they came from and their paradigms, and how they viewed whatever they were talking about. If even it came to size of mountains and trees and things, it's fascinating. But you're looking at here at this point, and you go, okay, their Eden, their overlapping space, is in the middle of their space. Okay, we have them even when God is up on the mountain. They're surrounding the mountain. They're at the base of the mountain. They're surrounding the mountain. There's a lot of people there, right? You figure a group that big it's a really long line if they're all standing in one long line in there. Again, surrounding that point on the mountain. So these center points, and then every time they set it up, as they traveled, they'd stop, and it was in the core. So the people around were the mobile land. They were the mobile land. So now you have this space, and the people that moved, they were the land of these mobile land. Then when we get to the actual promised land, Israel, eventually, many, many moons later, okay, it's approximately over 480 years until we get to the first temple, right? So the tabernacle is still in place as far as the building, right? The tent, the Eden space in the midst of the people, and they're living out their purpose in the land. They brought the tabernacle into the land, and that space is brought in that tabernacle. So those priests that had to do the duties of that tabernacle and take care of the rings and take care of the things and then replace things that broke, they were still doing their thing for a long time. That's 480 years. That's an old tent. Okay, I got a couple t-shirts that are 25 years old. Some older than that. But, oh boy. A lot older than that. 480 years. So King David, as they talked about, right, is just prior to the temple. And it's his 10th son, Solomon, that builds it. Yeah, there's probably a number 10 red string reference in there somewhere. We'll get that to another time, but the 10 is a number that God looks at, and Solomon's his 10th kid. There might be something to see. But But this is referred to in Israelite history as probably its heyday, right? That's what they were talking about. The time when it all came together. A man after God's own heart, ruling in the land that was promised, the tabernacle, Eden, in its midst. This is a time in a place that's yearned for, each in their purpose, or at least the opportunity of purpose. They are, at that time, being, okay, a light to the nations. The culmination of what Moses had argued to God to not wipe them out. If you do, then the nations will know you as the God who wiped out his own people, right? Or are you the God of promise? And his promise will speak to the nations. They are trying the best that many, one could argue most, at that time would know how to follow God in his ways. Worship, that's life. They were living life in God's ways, being that guiding light. And that would be a light to the nations. Okay. So one of the strongest points that I have for that home and purpose tied together, because I'm not sure how you can separate the two. You're there, and your purpose, that that light. So then we finally get to the point, roughly 420 plus years after the first temple, to the captivity of Babylon. That lasts about 70 years, right? Then they return. And John mentions this. He said, it's not what they remembered or pictured it to be, right? There's so much in this story that we can unpack, that we do not have time to unpack tonight, about the return to the land, the return to Jerusalem, the return to the temple. But one of the points that stood out to me in that story, when those exiles returned, was the crying, the extreme emotional reaction of the people when they heard Torah spoken again. The purpose of rebuilding. Their purpose again? Maybe. Okay, so let's talk about the C.S. Lewis quote from The Weight of Glory, right? I was caught off and captivated by this writing of C.S. Lewis. You know I like C.S. Lewis. And this caught me, okay? In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I'm almost committing an indecency, trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you. The secret which hurts so much that you have to take revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when, in very intimate conversation, the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect laughed at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it. And we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Our commonest expedient is to call it beauty and behave as if it had already settled the matter. Wordsworth's expedient was to identify with certain moments in his own past. But this is all a cheat. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. What he remembered would turn out to be in itself a remembering. the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located would betray us if we trust them. It was not in them. It only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, these are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, and news from a country we have never yet visited. C.S. Lewis, The Way to Glory. So that might really encompass not only the return of the people to the land after the Babylonian captivity of 70 years, but now we especially, right, even the thought of those in exile today, right? Whether Jew from the land or really all of us, the void of missing the Eden space, that overlapping space. Remember, the children of Israel in the land were supposed to be the protectors of that space and a light to the nations, right? So this is one of those reflective lamps in this picture. So there's a couple of elements, things you could talk about here, which are very interesting. One is you would have to keep oil in the lamp. We've got those analogies that go through and talk about, which are neat. Then you have trimming the wick, right? That's mentioned in scripture. I think it's kind of cool, important. And this reflective point, that's really what focuses and expands the light, right? So it's keeping the glass clean, keeping the ring, keeping the wick trim, keeping the deal, and keeping the reflector, what really everybody is going to see in this bright reflecting out, keeping that clean, keeping that pure, keeping that unblemished, keeping that, and you'd say the integrity of because these are metal, right? This isn't glass. This is metal. So the integrity of the metal, that you're keeping it, you keep it crack free, those good things. There's an integrity. There's so many other words that we've used and talked about over our time with this. So, so maybe one could say that since the land was prior to 1948, and that's extremely young in the timelines that we're talking about, where it was void of people and sacred space. The land of Israel was void of people and sacred space. Okay, remember, the Ark of the Covenant was lost at the Babylonian captivity around 600 BC-ish, okay, and has not been seen since. That space was taken, lost, hidden, as some surmise, right? That's a whole nother discussion, right? But that's the last time there was truly a sacred space, an overlapping Eden-like state, right? Until the presence of Yeshua in the land. We're not only over 2,600 years from the last Eden space, the Ark Temple scenario, but we're 3,700 years to King David and the heyday of Israel, right? By the way, it's interesting to some, maybe. A friend of mine and I were talking about 1,000-year things, and coming across in this research for this was kind of fun. David was 1,000 years before Yeshua, roughly 1035 to 970 BC, right? So it makes you go, 1,000 years. Then the Messiah. Interesting. Huh? Things make you go, Echoes, patterns, remembering, right? So the last time we see any real reflection of Eden is in the life of Yeshua in this overlapping space, right? Um, so we are still the exiles, all of us in a different way. If an Israelite from the land, at least for those that are still in the diaspora, right? They're still there in diaspora. Yes, Israel is being gathered back. Of course, Yeshua reminds us of that, right? The lost sheep, right? I'm here to find the lost sheep of Israel. Context story. Again, something uncomfortable for people. We have created this doctrinal thought that this lost sheep, that I'll go seek the lost sheep, that we have this as this looking for the last lost sinner scenario, right? And you go, well, that's a nice little talk, and you can make it fit like lots of stories, but the context is he's talking about his lost sheep that he's going to find, because they're worried about all the people that are not in the land at the time that they know are out there. And he's going, I'm going to bring every last one of my sheep home. That's the context of the story. You can take it to mean something else. I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. That's hard. But it's not what the story is, and it's not the context of the story and who he happens to be talking about. It's interesting, something to chew on, something to chew on. So we're seeing through Yeshua a way home, an exile from a land void of that Eden space, void of that overlapping space. But we carry that longing, as C.S. Lewis talked about, we carry that longing for that space as we commune with the God that created it all, right? We carve out our own reminders of that space all the time. Everything from a garden in your backyard to a church. But to remind it again by the words of C.S. Lewis, for they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. For now, we live as if we are ruled by our king as best we can, as best we know how. Remember, we have a beautiful world that we live in. If you don't see that, you need to get out. Either one, just go out, see it. If not, go online. You're online now. So go online and see what others have seen of it. They're sharing of what they've seen through their eyes. Its grandeur can be breathtaking. Its beauty is awe-inspiring. But as Tim said, don't mistake it for the real meaning of one's life. And yet, like John mentions, that point in the Feast of Sukkot that he mentioned, and I love this. We love our home, but like once a year for a week, we leave outside of it like we don't have a home, because it's not a mistake that it's not our real home. Maybe that's why we do the feasts. We are all exiles in some way, and we yearn for the overlapping Eden space. It is a promise. It will eventually be here. Until then, remember. Remember. So, point to ponder for the evening, which I enjoy pondering. And this one, again, you can grant me literary uh, be nice to me. Anyways, so you know how I'm not a big fan of giving the adversary a name. Adversary, opposer, hostile one, right? Is a master theologian. He talked to God, interacted with God, believes in God's existence, and knows more about God's attributes and abilities than most. And yet, he doesn't love God. Knowledge about God doesn't equal faith in God. And I want to stretch that again. Thank you, Stephen Mattson, for sharing. I want to stretch that even some more and say knowledge about God doesn't equal a relationship, a love for God. And I hope we have both a love and a relationship as we seek that Eden overlapping space. We have the stories of in our scriptures. We remember something that we don't know. We have it explained to us as best it can. We see echoes, murmurs, whispers of it in nature. We yearn for that space. And we yearn for our God. Thanks for being with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.